The most dangerous thing to a narcissist is someone they can't decode. We all think narcissists fear confrontation, but the truth is they fear exposure. And the one who can expose them is someone who's already played their game and outgrown it. That someone is the Dark Empath. Sandra wasn't always unreadable. She used to be the kind of empath who over-explained, over-apologized, and over-loved. The kind of person narcissists find magnetic because she made them feel important, powerful, even godlike. Then came him. He love-bombed, idealized, made her feel like the most special person in the world, until he didn't. He withdrew affection, blamed her for everything, questioned her sanity, and somehow made her apologize for bleeding when he was the one holding the knife. And she forgave. Until one day, she didn't. That's the day he met someone he couldn't read anymore. Someone who didn't flinch when he shouted, didn't explain when he guilt-tripped, didn't defend when he lied. He thought she turned cold, but really, she turned awake. What happens when an empath gets tired of being manipulated? They don't become cruel. They become clear. This is the inner split between the empath who performs and the empath who sees. Carl Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." The narcissist avoids it through dominance. The empath avoids it through rescue. But the dark empath, they've faced the fire and realized their empathy is being devoured. Let me tell you about Veronica. For 28 years, she was the friend everyone called during their 3 a.m. breakdowns. The daughter who absorbed her mother's rage without fighting back. The partner who apologized for existing too loudly in someone else's space. Veronica believed her worth lived in her ability to heal others. She was the therapist friend, the shoulder to cry on, the person who could make anyone feel better about themselves. But what she didn't see was how this very gift was being weaponized against her. Every narcissist in her life had learned the same devastating truth. Veronica would rather hurt herself than hurt anyone else. So they used it. They pushed boundaries knowing she'd bend. They created chaos knowing she'd clean it up. They broke her heart knowing she'd forgive them before they even asked. Veronica's mother would call her screaming about her latest drama dump, all her emotional poison, then hang up feeling better while Veronica sat there shaking. Her ex-boyfriend would disappear for days, return with a half-hearted excuse, and Veronica would welcome him back with relief instead of anger. Her best friend would cancel plans, last-minute borrow money she never returned, and somehow Veronica always ended up apologizing for bringing it up. This wasn't love. This was a trauma response, a desperate attempt to earn safety by being indispensable. Veronica had learned early that her emotions made people uncomfortable. Her tears were too much. Her anger was scary. Her needs were selfish. So she learned to shrink, to give, to absorb everyone else's pain so they wouldn't abandon her. She became what Jung would call a wounded healer, someone who tries to heal others to avoid healing themselves. But wounded healers don't actually heal anyone. They just enable others to stay broken while breaking themselves in the process. Veronica's breaking point came on a Tuesday night. She'd spent her entire day counseling a friend through a breakup, lending money to her sister, and listening to her mother's complaints about her father. By the time she got home, she was emotionally empty, depleted, running on fumes. That's when her phone rang. It was Jake, her on and off boyfriend of 3 years. The same Jake who'd told her she was too sensitive when she cried. The same Jake who'd gaslit her into believing his cheating was somehow her fault. The same Jake who disappeared whenever she needed support, but expected her to drop everything when he called. "Veronica, I need you," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm going through something really hard right now, and you're the only one who understands me." And for the first time in her life, Veronica felt something shift inside her chest. Not the familiar rush to rescue, not the desperate need to be needed, just clarity. She looked at her phone and realized Jake wasn't calling because he loved her. He was calling because he was empty and he needed someone to fill him up. And Veronica had spent 3 years being his emotional gas station. "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" Jake's voice changed, becoming sharper. "Veronica, don't be selfish. I really need you right now." But instead of the usual guilt that would send her scrambling to apologize, Veronica felt something else: anger. Clean, clear, protective anger. "I'm not being selfish," she said. "I'm being honest. I've been giving you pieces of myself for 3 years, and you've never once asked what I needed. You don't love me, Jake. You love what I do for you." The silence on the other end was deafening. That night, something shifted. Not broken, awakened. Veronica had integrated what Jung called the shadow, the parts of herself she'd rejected. Her anger, her selfishness, her right to say no, her need to be seen as more than just a source of comfort for others. She still felt deeply, but she no longer used her empathy to earn love. She used it to read danger. And when the narcissists in her life met this version of her, they saw something unsettling. The person who once begged for their approval was now emotionally invisible. The usual manipulation tactics, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, silent treatment, none of it worked anymore. Because the dark empath doesn't react. They witness. Have you ever watched someone try to manipulate a wall? That's what it looks like when a narcissist encounters someone who's stopped performing empathy for an audience. The dark empath has learned the difference between empathy and emotional slavery, between compassion and self-destruction, between loving someone and losing themselves in the process. They're no longer the empath who saves everyone. They're the empath who saves themselves first. And to a narcissist, nothing is more terrifying than a witness who doesn't flinch. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming whole, not by rejecting our empathy, but by refusing to let it be used against us. The dark empath isn't dark because they're cruel. They're dark because they've stopped lighting themselves on fire to keep others warm. They've become what every empath is meant to become: discerning. At this point, the narcissist will double down. They'll say, "You've changed. You've become cold. You're just like me." But they're wrong. The dark empath isn't like them. They don't manipulate, they mirror. They don't seek control, they've reclaimed self-possession. Let me tell you what really happens when a narcissist realizes they can no longer access their former victim. Remember Jake? He was Veronica's ex-boyfriend, the one who convinced her that her sensitivity was a flaw, the one who'd disappear for days, then return with flowers and excuses, the one who made her believe that love meant accepting crumbs while he feasted elsewhere. For 3 years, Veronica danced to his emotional music. When he was happy, she was relieved. When he was angry, she was terrified. When he was gone, she was desperate. Her entire emotional state depended on his mood, his approval, his presence. But when Veronica awakened to her own worth, Jake noticed immediately. The texts he used to send the ones designed to make her chase him went unanswered. The guilt trips that once sent her scrambling to apologize now hit a wall of silence. Jake tried everything. He love-bombed again, sending her poems about how special she was, how no one understood him like she did how they were meant to be. When that didn't work, he tried anger, calling her selfish and unforgiving, accusing her of throwing away what we had. When that failed, he played victim, telling mutual friends how Veronica had changed and become heartless. But Veronica didn't defend herself. She didn't explain her side of the story. She didn't even block him. She just stopped participating. This is what broke Jake's mind. He could handle fight or flight. He'd built his entire identity around triggering those responses in others. His self-worth came from making people react to him with love, with anger, with desperation. It didn't matter as long as they were reacting. But freeze calculated conscious protective freeze. He had no playbook for that. The narcissist expects a reaction. They need it. Their entire sense of power comes from your emotional dysregulation. But instead of chaos, they get stillness. Instead of explanation, they get silence. Instead of pursuit, they get absence. Why? Because the dark empath has learned the most revolutionary truth of all. You don't owe anyone your chaos. They've stopped trying to be understood by someone who only listens to feel superior. They're no longer giving emotions to someone who turns vulnerability into ammunition. This is where Jung's concept of projection becomes crystal clear. The narcissist had been projecting their own emotional patterns onto Veronica, expecting her to react with the same ego-driven desperation they would feel. But Veronica had transcended that game entirely. She wasn't fighting back because she no longer saw Jake as an opponent. She saw him as a person trapped in his own psychological prison, and she was no longer volunteering to be his cellmate. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Veronica had used Jake's behavior as a mirror to see her own patterns of self-abandonment. And once she saw them, she couldn't unsee them. Jake's manipulation had worked for so long because Veronica was afraid of being abandoned. But the dark empath has made peace with being alone. They've realized that being abandoned by someone who never truly saw them isn't a loss, it's a liberation. The dark empath doesn't become cruel in response to cruelty. They become unavailable to it. They've realized that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And indifference to someone who feeds on emotional reactions feels like death. Jake tried escalating. He showed up at Veronica's apartment, unannounced tears in his eyes, begging her to be the person she used to be. The person who would have opened the door immediately sat him down, made him tea, and absorbed his pain until he felt better. But Veronica looked at him through the window and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even pity. Just clarity. She'd finally learned that empathy without boundaries isn't love, it's self-destruction. That caring without discernment isn't kindness, it's codependency. When she didn't open the door, Jake's mask slipped completely. The tears stopped. His face hardened. He started pounding on the door, screaming about how selfish she was, how she owed him after everything he'd done for her, how she was just like every other heartless bitch. And in that moment, Veronica saw him clearly for the first time. Not as the broken man she needed to save, but as someone who had never loved her at all. He'd loved her function, her willingness to absorb his emotions, her inability to leave. The person screaming outside her door wasn't heartbroken. He was angry that his emotional supply had been cut off. Veronica didn't call the police. She didn't engage. She just waited until he exhausted himself and left. Because she understood something now that she'd never understood before. His reaction wasn't about losing her. It was about losing control. That night, Jake realized he'd lost something he'd never valued until it was gone. Access to someone's beautiful, generous heart. But Veronica realized something even more important, that heart had always belonged to her. She'd just forgotten. The dark empath had been born not from hatred, but from self-love. Not from cruelty, but from boundaries. Not from coldness, but from the kind of warmth that finally knew its own worth. This transformation wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who she'd always been, underneath the layers of people-pleasing and trauma responses. The real Veronica, the one who'd been buried under years of overgiving, was finally free to breathe. This isn't revenge. This is evolution. And evolution, once it happens, can never be undone. The narcissist expects the empath to return to their old patterns eventually. They wait for guilt to kick in, for loneliness to break them down, for their soft heart to win out over their boundaries. but they're waiting for a person who no longer exists. What happens next isn't loud, it's quiet. The narcissist begins to panic, not because the dark empath is fighting back, but because they're no longer playing. They've withdrawn their energy. They've stopped narrating, stopped defending. Now they only observe with surgical clarity. Think about what this means for someone whose entire identity depends on being the center of someone else's emotional universe. The narcissist might try to bait them, create drama, triangulate with other people, spread rumors designed to pull the dark empath back into reaction. But nothing lands. It's like watching someone throw rocks at a lake that's learned to be still. The rocks sink without even creating ripples. This is when the narcissist realizes they've lost control, not because they were outsmarted, but because they can no longer access. And without access, the narcissist loses power. Veronica's transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no big confrontation, no tearful goodbye speech, no social media announcement about cutting off toxic people. She simply stepped back. When Jake texted, she read but didn't respond. When he called, she let it go to voicemail without listening. When he showed up places she'd be, she acknowledged him with the same polite distance she'd show a stranger. This terrified him more than anger ever could. Anger meant she still cared. Silence meant she'd moved beyond caring. But Veronica's journey didn't end with Jake. The patterns she'd recognized in that relationship existed everywhere in her life. Her mother still called expecting free therapy. Her sister still borrowed money without returning it. Her friends still dumped their problems on her without asking how she was doing. The difference was that Veronica no longer felt obligated to say yes. When her mother called in crisis mode, Veronica listened for a few minutes, then said, "Mom, this sounds really hard. Have you considered talking to a therapist about this?" When her mother got angry about Veronica's coldness, Veronica simply said, "I love you, but I can't be your counselor anymore. I'll talk to you when you're ready to have a conversation instead of a therapy session." Her mother hung up furious. But Veronica didn't chase her. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain herself further. She'd learned that the people who get angry when you set boundaries are usually the ones who were benefiting from you having none. Jung wrote about the transcendent function, the bridge between our conscious and unconscious minds that allows us to integrate our shadows and become whole. Veronica had found that bridge. She'd integrated her anger without becoming angry, her disappointment without becoming bitter, her hurt without becoming vengeful. She'd become something Jake, her mother, and everyone else couldn't compute a person who felt everything but was owned by nothing. The narcissist needs you to need them. They need your approval, your attention, your emotional labor. They need to matter to you more than you matter to yourself. But the dark empath has flipped that script entirely. They matter to themselves first, and from that place of inner security, they can choose who else deserves their energy. Veronica started asking herself questions she'd never asked before. Does this person add to my life or subtract from it? Do they celebrate my growth or feel threatened by it? Do they love me or do they love what I do for them? The answers showed her who deserved her energy and who was simply taking it. Some people in Veronica's life surprised her. Her friend Rachel, who she'd thought only called when she needed something, actually started checking in on Veronica more often. "You seem different," Rachel said. "More yourself. I like it." Others showed their true colors. When Veronica stopped being available for every crisis, stopped saying yes to plans that drained her, stopped apologizing for taking up space, some people disappeared entirely. At first, this hurt. But then Veronica realized, if someone only wanted her around when she was giving more than she was receiving, they didn't actually want her around. They wanted what she provided. The mirror doesn't lie, and the dark empath has become a mirror too sharp to touch without bleeding. Jake tried everything he could think of. He sent flowers to her work with notes about how sorry he was. He reached out to her friends, painting himself as the victim of her sudden cruelty. He even started dating someone who looked like her, posting pictures on social media he knew she'd see. But Veronica's response was always the same: nothing. Not because she didn't feel, but because she'd learned to feel without reacting, to observe without absorbing, to witness without rescuing. This is the dark empath's greatest power. They've become emotionally self-sufficient. They don't need the narcissist's approval to feel valuable. They don't need their attention to feel seen. They don't need their love to feel worthy. They've become their own source of validation. And that's what makes them truly dangerous, not to others, but to the systems that once fed off their emptiness. Veronica had spent 30 years believing that love meant sacrifice, that caring meant suffering, that empathy meant absorbing everyone else's pain. But she'd learned something revolutionary. Healthy love enhances both people. Healthy caring includes caring for yourself. Healthy empathy has boundaries. She wasn't becoming cold, she was becoming whole. Sandra didn't become someone else. She became herself without distortion. She now understands not everyone deserves her empathy. Silence can be love for herself. Boundaries are not punishment. They're protection for what's sacred. She doesn't rescue anymore. She recognizes. She doesn't try to fix. She chooses whether to stay or walk away. And most of all, she knows now. You're not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. This is what Veronica learned in her quiet awakening. That empathy without boundaries isn't love, it's self-abandonment. That caring without discernment isn't kindness, it's codependency. Veronica's life looked different now. Her phone was quieter, but the conversations she did have were deeper. Her calendar was less full, but the activities she chose actually brought her joy. Her relationships were fewer, but they were real. She'd learned to ask herself the question that changed everything. Is this person capable of loving me the way I love them? The answer separated her true friends from her emotional vampires. Veronica discovered she actually enjoyed her own company. She started taking herself to movies, to restaurants on weekend trips. She stopped waiting for someone else to make plans and started making her own. The solitude she'd once feared became her sanctuary. The silence she'd once filled with other people's drama became a space for her own thoughts to emerge. She began journaling, not to work through other people's problems, but to understand her own mind. She started therapy not because she was broken, but because she wanted to grow. She took up painting, dancing, reading things she'd abandoned because they weren't useful to anyone else. For the first time in her life, Veronica was living for herself. The narcissist can't control someone who doesn't need approval. The dark empath doesn't seek validation. They've integrated their shadow. They've made peace with their anger, owned their selfishness, accepted their imperfections, and in doing so, they've become unmanipulatable. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you really are instead of who you think you should be. Veronica had individuated from her trauma patterns. She'd separated her worth from her usefulness. She'd divorced her identity from her ability to heal others. That's what makes the dark empath dangerous, not to others, but to the systems that once fed off their compliance. They've become what every empath is meant to become: sovereign. Veronica still felt deeply. She still cared about people. She still wanted to help when she could. But now she helped from a place of abundance, not emptiness. She gave from her overflow, not her reserves. She loved others without abandoning herself. This is the dark empath's true power. They've learned to love without losing themselves in the process. They've become living proof that you can be both soft and strong, both caring and boundaried, both empathetic and self-protective. The old Veronica would have felt guilty about the changes. The new Veronica felt proud. She'd finally come home to herself. So, what happens when a narcissist meets a dark empath? They don't fight. They don't bond. They orbit and eventually drift apart. Because one needs to consume, and the other has stopped being edible. If you've been the empath giving forgiving, absorbing pain that wasn't yours, let this be your awakening. Your light was never the problem. Your lack of protection was. Now you know better. You don't owe your empathy to everyone. You don't need to be the bigger person to be a whole one. Jung reminds us, the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. Next time someone tries to decode, you smile, because they'll never find the old version of you again. And that's not cruelty, that's freedom. If this resonated with you, take a moment to sit with whatever came up. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is simply witness our own story without trying to fix it. You're not broken. You're not too much. You're not responsible for other people's emotional regulation. You're just ready to come home to yourself.